There is a mountain in Saudi Arabia that the government has fenced off from the public, surrounded by armed guards, with signs that say no entry, no photography, no access. And at the top of that mountain, the rocks are black, scorched, burnt from the inside out, in a land where there has been no volcanic activity for thousands of years. Locals have called this mountain by the same name for centuries. Jebel Musa in Arabic, the Mountain of Moses, and almost no one in the Western world is allowed near it. Today we are going to follow the evidence, the scripture, the archaeology, and the geography, and ask one of the most explosive questions in biblical history. What if everything we were taught about Mount Sinai is wrong? If you grew up in a church, or went to Sunday school, or watched any biblical documentary in the last 50 years, you were shown the same image. A rocky mountain in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, in modern-day Egypt, called Jebel Musa, the traditional Mount Sinai, where St. Catherine's Monastery sits at its base, built in the 6th century AD by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. This is the mountain that millions of tourists and pilgrims visit every year. This is the mountain on every map, in every Bible atlas, on every Sunday school wall. But here's the problem. This location was not identified as Mount Sinai until the 4th century AD, over 1,000 years after the Exodus. Before that, nobody agreed on where it was. The early church historian Eusebius placed it somewhere else entirely. Several early church fathers disagreed with each other completely, and the monastery at its base was not built because of overwhelming historical evidence. It was built because the emperor's mother, Helena, had a dream. A dream. That is the entire historical foundation for the location that has appeared in your Bible atlas your whole life. So if it wasn't there, where was it? To find the real Mount Sinai, we have to go back to the only source that actually matters, the text itself, and read it carefully, paying attention to the geographical details that most people skip right over. Clue number 1, Midian. When Moses fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian soldier, where did he go? Exodus chapter 2 says he fled to the land of Midian. He sat down by a well. He met the daughters of Jethro. He married Zipporah, and he settled there. Now here is the critical question. Where was Midian? Every serious scholar of ancient Near Eastern geography agrees. Midian was not on the Sinai Peninsula. Midian was in northwestern Saudi Arabia, on the eastern side of the Gulf of Aqaba. This is not controversial among historians. Ancient Midian is consistently placed in what is today the northwestern region of Saudi Arabia, a place called the Hijaz. So Moses, living in Midian, working as a shepherd for his father-in-law Jethro, was in Arabia. Clue number 2, the burning bush. Exodus chapter 3 says that Moses was tending Jethro's flock, and he led them to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. He was already in Midian. He walked to the mountain from Midian. The mountain was accessible from where he was living. If Midian was in Arabia, the mountain was in Arabia. Clue number 3, Paul's letter to the Galatians. Now this one stops people cold when they read it. In Galatians chapter 4 verse 25, the Apostle Paul writes this. Now Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia. Arabia. Paul, writing in the 1st century AD, within living memory of people who knew the geography intimately, states plainly and without qualification. Mount Sinai is in Arabia, not Egypt, not the Sinai Peninsula. Arabia. Now we need to talk about the route itself, because if Mount Sinai is in Arabia, then the crossing of the Red Sea had to happen somewhere completely different from where we have always been told. The traditional crossing site taught in most churches and documentaries is somewhere along the shallow, marshy areas of the northern Sinai, sometimes called the Reed Sea crossing, where the water was perhaps only a few feet deep. But the Hebrew text uses the words Yam Suf, which most accurately translates as the Sea of Reeds, or more specifically, based on other Old Testament usages. It refers to what we today call the Gulf of Aqaba. The Gulf of Aqaba is the eastern finger of the Red Sea. It runs between the Sinai Peninsula on the west and Saudi Arabia on the east. And at a specific point along that gulf, near a place called Nuweiba, something extraordinary happens with the underwater geography. There is an underwater land bridge, a natural pathway of sand that descends gradually from the Sinai side, crosses the floor of the Gulf, and rises on the Saudi Arabian side. At its deepest point, this land bridge sits approximately 800 meters below the surface. Researchers and divers in the 1970s and 1980s, including Ron Wyatt, an amateur archaeologist whose work remains controversial but whose geographical observations have been repeatedly confirmed, reported finding coral-encrusted objects at the bottom of this crossing point that appeared to be chariot wheels. Columns have also been found on both shores, one still standing on the Saudi side near the beach at Nuweiba, the other fallen into the water on the Egyptian side. Ancient inscribed columns, traditionally associated with Solomon, marking the site of the crossing. The beach at Nuweiba is remarkable for one specific reason. It is the only place along the entire Gulf of Aqaba large enough to hold the millions of Israelites that Exodus describes. A wide flat plain that opens up between mountains, funneling directly to the water's edge. If you were being chased by Pharaoh's army, and you came through the mountain passes and found yourself on that beach with water ahead and cliffs on either side, you would understand exactly why the people cried out in despair. They were trapped until the water opened. So the Israelites crossed the Gulf of Aqaba. They are now on the Arabian side, in what is today Saudi Arabia. And Exodus tells us they journeyed through the wilderness of Shur, then the wilderness of Sin, then to a place called Rephidim, where there was no water and Moses struck the rock. And then finally, they came to the mountain of God. Now let's look at the map of northwestern Saudi Arabia. From the crossing point at Nuweiba, traveling southeast into the Arabian interior, you eventually reach a region called the Hijaz. And in the Hijaz, there is a mountain, Jebel al-Lawz. It stands approximately 2,580 meters tall, making it the highest peak in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And at its summit, the rocks are black. Not the gray-brown of ordinary desert rock, not the color of weathered sandstone. Black, burnt, scorched to a color so distinct from the surrounding landscape that you can see it from a distance. And the Bible tells us exactly why that would be. Exodus chapter 19 verse 18 says, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The mountain burned when God came down. And Jebel al-Lawz still bears those burn marks today. In the late 1980s, two men named Bob Cornuke and Larry Williams illegally entered Saudi Arabia, specifically to investigate Jebel al-Lawz. Saudi Arabia at the time had restricted all access to the site. What they found when they got there, they documented in photographs and later in books and interviews. At the base of the mountain, they found a large flat plain, exactly the kind of plain where millions of people could encamp. They found a large split rock sitting on a hill with evidence of water erosion around its base. In the middle of a desert where no water source exists, consistent with water having poured from it in large quantities. This lines up with the account of Moses striking the rock at Rephidim and water flowing from it. They found the remains of what appeared to be a large altar made of stones piled together, with petroglyphs carved into the surrounding rocks, images of cows, bulls, calves. The golden calf. Exodus 32. The Israelites built an altar and worshipped a golden calf while Moses was on the mountain. The images carved around that altar site look exactly like what you would expect people to carve when they were worshiping an Egyptian-style bull deity. And they found boundary markers, stone markers set in a line around the base of the mountain, consistent with Exodus 19 verse 23, where God told Moses to set boundaries around the mountain so that the people could not come near it. Now, Cornuke and Williams were not professional archaeologists, and their methods were not peer-reviewed, and they were operating illegally inside Saudi Arabia. So their findings have to be treated carefully. But here is what gives their observations more weight. Saudi Arabia, immediately after their visit, fenced off Jebel al-Lawz entirely, surrounded it with government signs, stationed guards at the access points, and has refused all requests from archaeologists and researchers to conduct formal excavations there. Why would a government restrict access to an ordinary mountain? Now let's be honest about something. The mainstream academic and archaeological community has not accepted Jebel al-Lawz as the real Mount Sinai. Many scholars reject the identification for various reasons. Some question the dating and identification of the petroglyphs, arguing they could be from any period. Some question the Exodus narrative itself, arguing there is no archaeological evidence of millions of Israelites living in Egypt or traveling through the Sinai at all. Some argue that Midian's location is not as definitively Arabian as others claim. These are legitimate scholarly debates, and they deserve to be acknowledged. However, there is a growing body of serious researchers, including some with formal academic credentials, who argue that the traditional Sinai location in Egypt has far less going for it than most people realize. Dr. Glenn Fritz, a geographer with formal academic training, wrote an entire peer-reviewed book called The Lost Sea of the Exodus, making the case for the Gulf of Aqaba crossing and the Arabian location. Professor Emmanuel Anadi excavated a different mountain in the Sinai called Har Karkum, and found extraordinary evidence of ancient religious activity, but even he placed his candidate site in the actual Sinai desert rather than the traditional tourist location of St. Catherine's. What virtually all serious researchers agree on is this: the traditional location at St. Catherine's Monastery, identified by a dream in the 4th century, and never seriously challenged because of its deep religious tourism infrastructure, has the weakest historical and geographical evidence of any proposed site. The question is not whether the traditional site is wrong. The question is which alternative is right. Let's go back to that black summit. The blackening at the top of Jebel al-Lawz is the detail that is hardest to explain away. The surrounding mountains in that region of Saudi Arabia are all the same color, the gray-brown orange of typical desert granite and sandstone. Jebel al-Lawz alone has a summit that is distinctly and dramatically black. Geologists who have looked at photographs of the site have offered various explanations, including the possibility of ancient volcanic or hydrothermal activity. But the region is not known for volcanic history in the relevant time frame. Others have suggested the blackening is simply a different type of rock composition at higher altitudes on that specific peak. But here is what makes this detail so striking. Exodus 19 describes the scene when God descended on the mountain this way. There was thunder and lightning, a thick cloud over the mountain, a very loud trumpet blast. The whole mountain trembled violently, and it was covered in smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. Whatever happened on that mountain, the biblical text describes an event of intense heat and fire. And this specific mountain, alone among its neighbors, looks like something burned it. You can call that coincidence. You can call it geology, but you cannot call it nothing. The altar site at the base of Jebel al-Lawz deserves its own attention. Exodus 32 describes the golden calf incident in detail. Aaron collected gold from the people, fashioned it into a calf, built an altar before it, and declared a festival. The Israelites ate and drank and engaged in revelry before this altar. At the base of Jebel al-Lawz, the site that Cornuke and Williams photographed shows a rectangular stone enclosure, with the surrounding rock face covered in ancient petroglyphs. The petroglyphs show bovine figures, cattle and bulls, carved repeatedly across the rock face near the altar enclosure. Now, petroglyphs of cattle are not unusual in ancient Arabia. People throughout the ancient Near East kept cattle and depicted them. But the combination of a stone altar enclosure at the base of a mountain, surrounded specifically by cattle imagery, in a location that geographically matches the biblical narrative, that combination is at minimum worth serious investigation. What makes the Saudi government's response so frustrating to researchers is that a proper archaeological excavation of this site could potentially answer these questions definitively. Proper carbon dating of organic material found at the altar, proper analysis of the rock blackening at the summit, proper survey of the boundary markers. All of this is possible. None of it has been permitted. And that raises a question that no one in official channels seems eager to answer. What are they protecting? There is one more piece of evidence that deserves serious attention. Near the base of Jebel al-Lawz sits a massive rock. Not just large, massive, several stories tall, sitting on a small hill, and it is split directly down the middle. A clean vertical split, dividing this enormous boulder into two halves. Around the base of this rock, the ground shows clear signs of water erosion, smooth channels worn into the rock and soil around it, the kind of erosion patterns that are caused by large volumes of water flowing outward in multiple directions from a central point. In the middle of the Arabian desert, where it almost never rains, where there is no river, no spring, no water source of any kind, the ground around this split rock looks like water once poured out of it. Exodus 17, and again in Numbers 20, describes Moses striking a rock at God's command and water flowing out of it for the people and their livestock to drink. The Hebrew word used for this rock in Exodus 17 is tsur, meaning a large cliff face or boulder. The split rock at Jebel al-Lawz is exactly that, a massive boulder, split open, with water erosion evidence at its base. Photographs of this rock are available and have been published, and the water erosion channels are clearly visible. Again, a geologist could offer alternative explanations, ancient rainfall patterns, different erosion mechanisms. But the convergence of details keeps building. A mountain in the right location, with the right name, with a burnt summit, with an altar and cattle petroglyphs at its base, with boundary markers around it, with a massive split rock nearby showing water erosion, in a region that matches every geographical clue in the text. At what point does convergence become evidence? Some people hear this kind of content and ask, why does it matter where Mount Sinai actually was? The events happened. God spoke. Moses received the law. That's what matters. And that is true. But here is why the geography matters. Because for generations, the fact that archaeologists found no evidence of the Exodus at the traditional sites in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula was used as an argument against the biblical narrative itself. If millions of people traveled through the Sinai for 40 years and we found nothing, maybe the story isn't historical. But if the route was never through the Sinai at all, if they crossed at the Gulf of Aqaba, traveled through northwestern Arabia, camped at a mountain in the Hijaz, then we have been looking in the wrong place for 2,000 years. And the absence of evidence at the wrong location is not evidence of absence. It is simply evidence that we were looking in the wrong place. The geography of Arabia, the geological features of Jebel al-Lawz, the textual evidence of Galatians 4, the ancient name preserved by local people for centuries. All of it points east, across the water, into Arabia, to a fenced-off mountain that no one is allowed to investigate. The traditional Mount Sinai in Egypt has stood as the accepted answer for over 1,500 years, not because the evidence demanded it, but because a monastery was built there. And once a monastery is built, pilgrims come. And once pilgrims come, the economy follows. And once the economy follows, the question stops being asked. But the text never stopped saying what it says. Paul never stopped writing that Mount Sinai is in Arabia. The locals around Jebel al-Lawz never stopped calling it the Mountain of Moses. And the summit of that mountain has never stopped being black. The truth about where God met Moses, where the 10 Commandments were given, where the covenant between God and Israel was made, may be sitting right now behind a fence in the Saudi Arabian desert, waiting the way truth usually waits, quietly, patiently, for someone to finally stop looking in the wrong direction